The first scream did not come from a human throat. It rose from the wind itself, a sharp, tearing cry that swept across the Irish coast as Brother Ciaran leaned over the cliff's edge. Torchlight trembled across the black water, breaking into shards on the waves. Salt stung his eyes, yet he could not look away. Beneath him, the sea rolled like a living omen, reflecting streaks of red that should not have been there. He remembered the damaged vellum fragments stored in the scriptorium, a warning scribbled by an unknown monk. The sea carried omens red as wounds. Now the prophecy took form. Longships erupted from the darkness. Their prows rose like carved beasts, painted eyes glinting with a malice that needed no language. Oars dipped in unison, slicing the water with a rhythm that felt older than scripture. Ciaran's breath snagged. He stepped back as the monastery bells clanged overhead, not the measured call to prayer but frantic, uneven strikes of pure alarm. The air tasted of iron and smoke, as though the raid had already begun in the wind's imagination. Below, novices raced across the courtyard. Their white robes flashed in the torchlight as they hauled chests of relics toward the chapel door, fragments of saints' bones, a gilded psalter, the ivory chalice carved generations earlier. Their hands shook. The relics slipped. Faith itself seemed to tremble. Ciaran rushed down the stone steps, each one slick with sea mist. By the time he reached the cloister, the longships had struck sand. He felt the impact through the earth, a deep, violent shudder like the world itself exhaling in dread. Shadows leapt from the surf, tall, broad-shouldered raiders, axes lifted as casually as candles. A novice named Fintan collided with Ciaran, breath ragged, clutching a small wooden cross. "They are here," the boy whispered, voice splitting at the edges. Ciaran steadied him, but his own pulse thundered. He could not deny the truth. The storm had arrived wearing human faces. Smoke drifted from oil lamps knocked askew. Livestock bellowed. A stack of parchments caught a stray spark, curling into ash before his eyes. Still, amid all the noise, one thing struck him hardest. The silence. A sudden, unnatural stillness spread between the monastery walls, an emptiness so complete it made the hairs rise along his arms. The raiders paused outside the gate, listening, assessing, choosing their moment. Ciaran sensed something shift, a hinge between life before and life after. His hand closed around Fintan's shoulder. The boy trembled. The gate shuddered under the first blow. And in that heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single truth. Nothing that lived inside these walls would remain untouched by the fire riding in from the sea. The first axe blow sounded like a bone snapping. Sister Eleni froze mid-stride, the beeswax candle trembling in her grasp as its flame shuddered beneath the draft seeping through the cloister corridor. She had come from the quiet abbey in Tuam expecting refuge, not the violent tremor now rolling through Lindisfarne's outpost like a warning from the earth itself. Another strike boomed. Wood splintered. Dust sifted from the rafters in thin, ghostly veils. Brigid, barely 14, pressed against Eleni's side. The novice's breath hitched as shards of candlelight skittered across her freckled face. Eleni cupped a hand over the girl's, steadying her even as fear crawled cold across her own spine. She thought of the 9th century annals she had copied days earlier, the line that mentioned only the shattering of holy enclosures. A single phrase hiding 1,000 torments. The gate buckled again. The corridor answered with a groan. Eleni's sandals slipped slightly on the stone as she stepped back, pulling Brigid with her. She felt the girl's wrist pulse beneath her fingers, fast, frantic, pleading. Outside, boots pounded in a rhythm that mocked the monastery's former hymns. It was a tide without mercy, rushing closer with every heartbeat. Voices rose beyond the walls, guttural shouts clashing with the bell that tolled overhead, its desperate clang swallowed by chaos. Bridget whispered a prayer into her sleeve. The words shook. Her shoulders shook. Eleni lowered her forehead briefly to the girl's, the gesture instinctive, protective, a vow without sound. Her own faith flickered, thin as the candle now sputtering against her palm. Should she run? Should she bar the next door? Should she trust obedience when the world had turned predator at their threshold? Another blast of impact answered for her. The wooden gate cracked open like a wound. Cold air surged inside, carrying smoke and the metallic scent of seawater. The candle died with a hiss. Darkness pressed in, intimate and suffocating, broken only by the thin line of torchlight bleeding through the ruptured doorway. Eleni tightened her grip on Bridget, feeling the girl stiffen as silhouettes loomed behind the splintered frame. There was no choice left. The decision she had already been made by force. Eleni stepped back as the door gave way, the sound echoing through the cloister like a final judgment. And in that instant, between the last breath of sanctuary and the first breath of ruin, she understood that this moment would outlive stone, scripture, and memory. It would etch itself into history long after their voices fell silent. Harun pressed himself beneath the sagging lintel of the guesthouse doorway, the cold stone biting through his soaked cloak as the courtyard dissolved into violence. He had come seeking Christian refuge, believing the monastery's walls carried the weight of sanctuary. Instead, flames raced along the thatch like hungry spirits, casting frantic light across raiders tearing monks and villagers from hiding. The air burned with smoke, ash, and human cries. Donal emerged from the scriptorium clutching a half-translated psalter to his chest, the parchment trembling in his aged hands. Harun saw the old man's lips form a silent plea before a raider wrenched the manuscript away, scattering loose leaves like dying birds. Donal collapsed to his knees, reaching for the words that had defined his entire life. A cracked memorial slab discovered centuries later would list the abbey's missing, but the scribe's name, along with dozens more, would remain swallowed by stone. Harun's pulse hammered. He could flee. The path toward the outer wall still lay open, its shadows deep enough to hide his escape, yet his gaze dragged back to the scene unfolding near the gate. Bridget, small, terrified, barely more than a child, was being forced across the courtyard by a raider gripping her wrist. Her cry cut through the roar of flames, splitting Harun's resolve. Eleni staggered after the girl, held fast by two Vikings who ignored her desperate reach. Harun felt the moment tighten inside him like a snare. Every instinct insisted he run, live, preserve what little he had left. But another voice rose, quiet, persistent, anchored in the memory of those who had once sheltered him on his travels. He remembered Brother Eden offering him bread without question, the novices who laughed as they carried clay jugs of water, Donal showing him a margin drawing of a fish and saying it reminded him of hope. Lightning cracked above the sea, illuminating Bridget's terrified face for an instant. Harun stepped back toward the wall, torn between worlds, one of survival, one of obligation. The choice opened before him like a blade. Each heartbeat drove it deeper. By the time the raiders began dragging captives toward the shore, Harun had still not moved. The decision remained suspended, unrelenting, waiting to carve its answer into the night. Bridget stumbled through the surf, the coarse rope around her wrists carving raw grooves into her skin. Salt water soaked her hem, turning wool heavy against her legs as the tide pulled at her steps. Moonlight glimmered along the wet sand, revealing footprints that vanished as quickly as they formed. Every breath tasted of metal and fear. Ardor walked beside her, a Viking barely older than some of the monks he had dragged from their cells. His axe hung at his side, but his gaze flickered, not with cruelty, but with a brief, unreadable uncertainty. Later sagas would speak poetically of the lifting of captives, yet they would never mention how Brigid's shoulders shook or how her prayer tangled into the wind, too fragile to rise. Eleni, seized at her right, leaned close enough for Brigid to feel her trembling. The older woman whispered strength, just syllables, barely sound, her voice breaking under the weight of her own terror. The longship loomed ahead, its curved prow looming like a grave marker against the horizon. Torches flickered along its deck, throwing violent orange across the waves. Brigid's fingers curled around the wooden cross hidden in her palm. She had carved it during quieter days, whispering hopes into it as if the wood could carry her secrets. When Arthur noticed it, he hesitated. His eyes narrowed not in anger but in a strange recognition, something like the memory of mercy. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the overseer barked an order. The moment died. Arthur pushed Brigid forward. Her bare feet slipped on the seaweed-laced stones. Eleni stumbled beside her, catching herself on Brigid's shoulder. The ship towered above them, its hull shedding rivulets of seawater that gleamed like tears. Brigid lifted her gaze toward the dark sky, wondering if faith could survive being torn from its land. Could belief endure in chains? Could a prayer withstand the salt and the cold and the fear eating through her resolve? The longship's shadow swallowed her as she neared the plank. The ropes pulled tighter. The tide erased her footprints behind her, as if the shore itself refused to remember. Brigid stepped forward, uncertain whether she carried faith into the ship or whether the sea had already taken it from her. Gerard felt the heat before he saw tea. He flames. It rolled across the courtyard in waves that smelled of scorched wool, splintered oak, and parchment turning instantly to ash. He bent to lift the body of a fallen monk, his shackled wrists clinking as he dragged the lifeless weight aside to clear the raider's path. Smoke threaded into his lungs, sharp enough to make his vision swim. Months ago he had washed ashore on Viking-held territory believing rescue might come. Instead, chains met him before land's embrace did, and now he served the very men who laid waste to holy ground. The scriptorium roof groaned, then folded inward with a roar. Burning pages spiraled upward like dying birds, their edges glowing red, their words dissolving mid-flight. Gerard watched one drift near his feet. A single line of half-surviving script clung to its center, a psalm fragment later found charred in the soil by Clan MacNoise's ruined walls. He felt the weight of it as if the ink still breathed. These pages had carried centuries of devotion. Now they vanished in seconds. A sudden movement pulled his attention. Donal, the elderly scribe, crawled toward the collapsing building, his fingers clawing at the earth. His face shone with tears and soot as he reached for the flames, as though he could rescue the unrescued, as though his life's work might be snatched back from destruction by sheer will. His whisper, maybe a prayer, maybe a plea, was swallowed by the crackling inferno. The raiders laughed, their voices harsh against the night. One stepped forward, amused by Donal's desperate crawling. Gerard felt his muscles tense, a memory of former vows spiraling through him like a tightening cord. He used to protect the weak. He used to stand between danger and faith. Now he stood among those who mocked both. The sword strike was swift. Donal's cry cut short. The monk collapsed, blood unfurling across the stone and pooling around Gerard's knees. For a heartbeat, everything inside him turned still, his breath, his thoughts, even the fire's roar. He stared at the spreading red, feeling it soak into the hem of his tunic. He wanted to speak, to shout, to reach for the man who had once shown him hospitality. But silence, enforced by fear and survival, clamped around his throat like an iron collar. A raider barked an order, dragging Gerard back into motion. He rose because he had to, because refusal meant death, because slavery twisted choice until it resembled obedience. Yet as he stepped away from Donal's body, something inside him splintered. His loyalty, once a banner he carried with certainty, now twisted into knots of shame, sorrow, and bitter confusion. The monastery crumbled, ash drifted like snow, and Gerard walked forward, haunted by the truth that his hands, though bound, were part of the ruins settling over the unburied dead. Adelina pressed her son to her chest as the longship heaved away from the burning shore, its hull slicing through the black water with a slow, merciless rhythm. Behind them, the coast glowed red, Lindisfarne's sister outpost dissolving into smoke that stretched after them like a mourning veil. The child's small fingers clutched her tunic, his breath warm against her collarbone, the only living softness left in a world turned to iron. She rocked him instinctively, though her own body shook with exhaustion and salt-chilled fear. A Norse inventory, centuries later, would record her child with 3 flat words, small ones fit for trade, a ledger in which her entire world became a line of property. Adelina did not know of such documents, but she felt their truth tightening around her like a noose each time she looked at the raiders' hardened faces. She braced her feet against the shifting planks as the waves struck the sides, sending cold spray across her arms. Her son whimpered. She whispered a prayer into his hair, letting the wind carry her trembling voice. Arthur stood near the prow, watching. The young Viking had dragged countless captives aboard tonight, yet something in the way Adelina refused to break caught at him. Her spine stayed straight despite the choking smoke, despite the ropes, despite the future looming like a cliff edge. For a moment his gaze held hers, an unspoken recognition, a thread thrown between 2 ruined worlds. But recognition was not mercy, and it changed nothing in the cold machinery of the raid. The sea grew rougher. Swells lifted the vessel until the horizon tilted, swallowing sky and water into a single, endless blur. Adelina tightened her grip, knuckles white. The overseer strode toward her, claiming it was for safety, but his hands reached for the child with the certainty of ownership. Adelina twisted away, a raw cry ripping from her throat, louder than the wind, louder than the oars pounding in rhythm. Arthur hesitated, but only for a breath, before stepping back into the ranks expected of him. The overseer tore the child from her arms. The horizon devoured her scream. Her hands clutched at empty air as if she could gather I am back by force of memory alone. The sea offered no answer, only its vast, indifferent silence stretching toward a future that refused to reveal whether mother and son would ever meet again. Harun stepped onto Irish soil with a heart heavier than the sea that had nearly claimed him months earlier. The wind struck his face with the same salted chill he remembered, yet the world it carried had changed beyond recognition. Where the monastery once stood, solid stone, warm candles, Bridget's hopeful glance, he found only remnants. Melted bell bronze pooled like frozen tears beside scorched foundations. Grass grew in ragged patches around the faint outline of a courtyard where Sister Eleni had steadied terrified novices. The air itself felt wounded, as though the land still recoiled from the night it had been torn open. Local elders approached him slowly, studying the foreigner who returned to ruins. Their voices carried grief without volume, speaking of farms abandoned, fields left to rot, families who vanished into slavery or silence. A surviving tax roll, brittle with age, listed entire districts as empty, a single bleak word standing in place of hundreds of lives. Harun traced the letters with his thumb, feeling the weight of absence settle deeper into his chest. He knelt in the ash-filled grass, the soil warm under the sun yet still carrying the memory of fire. His fingers brushed a shard of stained glass, blue and gold, cool despite daylight. It must have once belonged to a window above the scriptorium, where Donal bent over his psalter, where hope had lived in color. Now it reflected only sky. Harun closed his eyes, forcing himself to see the faces he feared lost. Bridget being dragged toward the surf, her hair whipping across her cheeks. Eleni gripping her cross as the gate splintered. Gerard frozen between mercy and obedience. Adelina reaching for a child torn from her arms. "Did any of you survive?" he whispered, though no answer rose from the quiet fields. The ruins held their stories tight, guarding them like wounds that refused to heal. The wind pushed through the empty cloister arches with a sound almost like breath. Harun realized Ireland had not fallen in a single night. The blow had simply struck so deeply that the land never returned to itself. Scars remained where voices once sang. Silence lived where prayer once rose. He stood, yet the weight of questions followed him unyielding. Ireland had bled. Its grief lingered in stones and smoke and shattered glass, present, unspoken, waiting for someone to listen. Selka knelt beneath the collapsed threshold, her lantern casting an amber halo that trembled with every breath of wind. The cellar stones, long buried beneath centuries of soil, seemed to exhale as they emerged into light, damp, cold, and carrying the scent of rain mingled with the unmistakable musk of old death. She brushed her gloved fingers over the dirt, revealing a cluster of beads melted together into a single blackened mass. Their once smooth surfaces had warped under extreme heat, the way only a burning sanctuary could create. A nun's rosary, fused at the moment prayer was interrupted forever. Beside it lay a carved stone, its face marred by frantic gouges. Selka leaned closer, tracing the faint crescents with her thumb, fingernail marks, desperate ones. The excavation notes phrased it with sterile calm, evidence of abrupt abandonment, but the stone told a much harsher truth. Someone had fought to stay rooted in this place even as terror closed in. She imagined Bridget, the young novice torn from shore, her small hands digging into the stone as raiders stormed the cloister. She saw Sister Eleni gripping her cross, whispering a last prayer into the dark. She pictured Donal bending over his psalter, refusing to abandon his life's work even as flames consumed the scriptorium. And Adelina, slipping through her mind like a ghost, calling for the child taken from her arms as longships tore open the horizon. Their stories had scattered like ash across centuries, yet traces here whispered their names with stubborn clarity. Wind surged through the corridor, rattling debris and sending a low hum reverberating between the ruined walls. It sounded almost human, like breath caught between a sob and a prayer. Selka straightened, lantern raised higher, as if expecting shadows to step forward and finish the stories the earth had only begun to uncover. Along the far wall, embedded in the clay, she noticed a final detail, a sliver of stained glass, blue laced with gold. The exact colors Harun once found in the monastery's remains. Its edges were brittle, but in the lantern glow it flickered like a trapped fragment of dawn. The earth was speaking. Not with clarity, not yet, but with memory, with mourning, with the echoes of lives crushed beneath flame and tide. And Selka knew the greatest truth still lay hidden under untouched layers, waiting, breathing, refusing burial as long as someone remained to listen.